We have a great audience today and also great panelists. I would like to start with an introduction round. Jayde, would you mind unmuting yourself and introducing yourself?
Hi everyone, my name's Jayde Richmond and I'm the General Manager of Australia's National Anti-Scam Centre. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chris?
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Chris Sheehan. I'm the Executive for Group Investigations at National Australia Bank.
Thank you very much. Sean?
Hi everybody, my name is Sean Ryan. It's great to be here. I work with a fantastic company called Feedzai, where I'm Head of Fraud and Financial Crime Prevention across Asia Pacific.
Thank you. And my name is George Abraham. I'm the Managing Director of the Global Anti-Scam Alliance. We will start with a general overview of what's happening globally with the state of scams, and then zoom in on what's happening in Australia. So maybe a brief introduction of the Global Anti-Scam Alliance. Our mission is to protect consumers worldwide from scams. We do that because we really feel that scams are a global problem, which of course needs to be solved on a national level, but also on a global level by bringing together governments, law enforcement, consumer protection organizations, social media, banks, telecom operators. Everybody is unfortunately in one way or another misused by scammers, and we need to operate globally in order to fight them. What the Global Anti-Scam Alliance does is 4 things. One, we facilitate knowledge sharing in meetups like these, and you can always check our website, gasa.org, to check which meetups we have. But we also organize 3 summits this year. One in Brussels, together with the Belgium and Dutch authorities. One in Washington, D.C., together with Amazon and Capital One. And one in Singapore, together with the Singapore government and several stakeholders. Then we also facilitate networking. So if you're interested to join our community, please let me know. We really like to help people get in touch with each other and fight scammers better. We publish about 30 reports annually about the state of scams in the USA, in Brazil, in Singapore, Taiwan, and 30 other 2 countries, to not only share what's the current state of scams in that country, but also share the best practices to fight scammers in that country, to make sure that we are not reinventing the wheel every time. And finally, we are involved in the global cybercrime exchange to really make a step forward in sharing data across borders related to scams. I wanted to briefly highlight the study we did last year amongst nearly 50,000 consumers in 43 countries. We asked them, have you been scammed? What happened? Did you lose money? And several other questions. And I briefly want to highlight a few of our findings. I think one of our biggest issues as scam fighters in this group are that in general, consumers are very, very confident that they can recognize scams. Interestingly enough, the global average where people say I'm either confident or very confident is about 69%. Same for Australia. And some countries are more confident than others. In Indonesia and Egypt, this figure is way higher. While in Japan, they're the most modest, and only 32% says that they're confident in recognizing scams. But there seems to be a huge gap in the fact that we are all very confident, but we're getting scammed, unfortunately, anyways. We also see that many consumers are being targeted now. 59% globally of the participants in our survey said that at least once per month they get a WhatsApp message, a phone call, a Facebook ad containing a scam. In Australia, to my surprise, this figure is actually quite higher, but it's by far not the highest. In Hong Kong, the figure is 90%, Brazil 81%, and Malaysia 79%. I'm a digital person, so I expected actually that most people are being scammed via digital means. That's not actually the case. Text messages and phone calls are still the most popular tools for scammers to use. In Australia, text messages is slightly more popular than phone calls, which is slightly different from the global average. And email is a far more popular tool to target Australians than globally. Also, regarding social media, we see differences. Globally, Facebook, WhatsApp are the number 1 and number 2. That's for Facebook also the case in Australia, but Gmail is also very often named, as well as Outlook email. Revictimization is a huge problem. Revictimization actually has always been a problem with crime. We know from burglars that if a burglar went to your house and stole your television, you have a way higher chance that the same burglar comes back 3 months later because he knows you bought a new television set. Same happens online. People are often targeted again because they fell for a previous scam and their data is being shared. Unfortunately, there are also donkey lists going around, which is a terrible name, especially with investment scam victims who are then approached by a company saying, we were able to recover your money. Please pay us an administration fee or a tax fee, and we can send you the money back. And of course, there is no money. They just try to scam the victim again and again and again. Another interesting fact is that globally, scams are really hurting people. It's often a more personal kind of crime than your bike being stolen or even a burglar in your house, because the victim often feels guilty, which is, of course, should absolutely not be the case. It's the criminal who's doing the crime, not the victim. But unfortunately, the feeling is often, I've been stupid. How could I not see this? Interestingly enough, in Australia, the figure of people who feel emotional harm is slightly less than the global average. Finally, we also ask people, what is the main reason you have been scammed? Here we see an interesting difference between the global data and what we see in Australia. Globally, it's often, I was attracted to the offer and I went for it. And we see that especially in developing countries as the primary reason. In more developed countries, we see often what's also the case in Australia, I did not identify the deceit. So there we have a big opportunity to help consumers by helping them to recognize the scam earlier and faster. Another concern I have is the way people are checking if something is a scam. We also ask them, how do you check if a website is a scam? And unfortunately, apart from the rule, it's too good to be true, which is working less and less because scammers are getting smarter. We see that many old tricks we educated consumers in the past, like check if there's an SSL certificate or check for reviews, are being used. And unfortunately, every website, also those of the scammers nowadays, have an SSL certificate because it's free. And we know that 20 to 30% of all the reviews on review platforms are fake. So we have to be very careful in educating consumers because the simple tricks to recognize scams, unfortunately, no longer work. I'm running out of time, so I want to give the floor also now to Jayde to zoom in on the Australian picture. Jayde, give me 1 second to slide your... Yep, please go ahead, Jayde.
Thank you. All right. So hi, everyone. I've already introduced myself, but I'm going to talk about what the National Anti-Scam Centre is doing to protect consumers. And first, I'll give a little bit of context. So people will have seen this headline before, but over $3 billion was lost by Australian consumers to scams in 2022. And this was following year-on-year increases in scam losses. One of the responses to that has been the establishment in July 2023 of the National Anti-Scam Centre. And so the government in Australia invested $58 million in a world-leading initiative to establish the centre within the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. And the purpose and focus of the centre is really to facilitate partnerships across government, law enforcement, industry and consumer organisations to support the community in the fight against scams. So the key aspects of the centre are to be consumer-centric, collaborative, and to really improve coordination. And what we want to achieve through the centre is to protect vulnerable communities from scams, to improve consumers' ability to spot and avoid scams, make it simpler for consumers to report a scam and for victims to access support, to make Australia a less attractive target for scams, and overall reduce the economic and social harm caused by scams. Might move to the next slide, George. Thank you. So in 2023, we had received 301,791 scam reports. That was the most we've received in any given year, with almost 480 million reported loss. Now, that's a slight decrease on 2022, and we do consider that the establishment of the National Anti-Scam Centre, as well as some key initiatives that have been implemented in some sectors, particularly the banking sector, have resulted in us being able to turn the tide and start to see some reduction in scam losses. Since the establishment of the centre, there's been particularly a decline in investment scam losses that we saw towards the end of last year. The centre established a fusion cell, so essentially that's just a time-limited task force that brought together experts from private sector and government and law enforcement to, in a sense, experiment with a number of strategies to see how we could address and disrupt investment scam losses. And you'll see in this chart, during the second half of the year, when you compare the blue line, which is 2023, with the red line, which is 2022, we started to see a trajectory downwards in losses. And we believe some of that is because of the work and activities of the fusion cell and the partners involved in that. Might move to the next slide. Each quarter, the National Anti-Scam Centre publishes a report about the activities of the centre, as well as the statistics in terms of scam reports. The last two reports that we've put out have included data from Scamwatch, but soon we'll be also looking at data from a number of other portals. We want to make sure we're getting a whole perspective, including what banks and other reporting platforms are seeing. At the moment, this data that I'm showing now is based on Scamwatch reports. So you'll see that in the October to December quarter, there was a 43% decrease from the same quarter last year and 26% down from July to September. So we started seeing in the second half of the year some pretty significant changes, particularly in terms of losses. We saw a 31% decrease in losses by bank transfer, a 74% decrease in losses by cryptocurrency, and started to see a 22% decrease in social networking as a contact method that led to loss. Phishing scams remain the most reported scam type. And this is consistent, I think, with some of the slides that George showed before about what the patterns are in Australia, that we do see a really high level of people receiving text message phishing scams, and as well as phone scams. So this might be different to what some other countries see, but it's certainly something that a lot of organisations are focused on at the moment. We know that scammers are agile and using technology to improve their methods, and so we remain committed to ensuring that there's no weak links in the system. So part of what we're also doing is advocating as well for mandatory and enforceable codes in Australia, which would cover banks, telecommunications providers and digital platforms in terms of how they monitor, respond and address scams. So the government is currently considering introducing codes into these sectors in the future in terms of scams. Might move to the next slide. So looking at some more recent data, this slide really picks up on some monthly data from February. We can still see that there's a trend for financial losses continuing to fall. We've also included in this one data from Report Cyber. In Australia, Report Cyber is our law enforcement reporting portal. So they get a lot of the victim reports and losses. And we're now looking closely at that data as well. They have seen, when you compare to the same months in the previous year, some decreases, but certainly the losses are higher in our police reporting system than what we've shown for Scamwatch here. So we're going to be looking at all this data over the next few months to really get a better understanding of whether we are seeing significant decreases in Australia yet, and really to test our own data source too. So we might move to the next slide. Just in terms of how we're going about things that's leading to this, the Scam Centre, as I said, is aiming to make Australia a much harder target for scammers, and we're focusing on a few key capabilities. So one is the whole of ecosystem collaboration and disruption approach. So this does draw on the expertise across sectors and industries and government and law enforcement, and really looking at how we can implement timely disruption and explore proof of concepts with some of our industry partners to get scam losses down. So, for example, there's been some really interesting work done with banks and telecommunication companies around SMS phishing scams, and particularly implementing initiatives where the phone number that's in the SMS will redirect callers to that number to give them a warning about scams. And some of these have been quite effective, and we're looking at how these can be expanded in the future. The second one is data and intelligence gathering and reporting. So to support the early identification of scams and trends, as well, we're looking at data from Scamwatch reports, but also data from a lot of other organisations. And this intelligence will be brought together to help inform education and disruption activities and really focus on that early intervention. And finally, as a lot of different regions and countries do, awareness education and also improving consumer experience. So working with consumer organisations and consumer experts, the Anti-Scam Centre will ensure consistent messaging to help consumers identify and avoid scams, and also provide better education resources and outreach to help consumers. Might move to the next slide. In terms of our data sharing capability, a lot of our funding is directed towards building better data sharing technology, which will help the centre to receive a report from anywhere and centralise the intelligence, distribute that data in near real time. So that includes, to a bank to freeze an account, to a telco to block scam calls, to a digital platform to take down a social media account, or to a web host to remove a website, and also to analyse and act on the trends. Currently in Australia, there is no central source of data. So when we try to get a perspective on what's happening in scams, we really have to bring together a lot of different sectors and look at a lot of different reporting portals to understand exactly what might be happening. In the interest of time, I might move through to the next slide, just quickly talk about the fusion cells. So the fusion cells are the task forces. As I said, we focused the first one on investment scams. Some of the initiatives that came out of that fusion cell included trialling an advertisement takedown strategy, and digital platform companies provided our teams with access to channels to rapidly take down scam advertisements. Using intelligence from scam reports and proactive surveillance, we were able to identify ads for takedown. And these were taken down by a range of providers. So we had a lot of partners, including Meta and Google and Microsoft, particularly active in that fusion cell. We also looked at disruption of imposter bond scams. And just to give an example, in one case, the Scam Centre received advice from a local wealth management firm that it was being impersonated as part of an imposter bond scam. Victims were drawn into the scam through online inquiries in low-risk investments, such as term deposits. After clicking on an online ad, the victims were prompted to enter contact details, and this initiated contact with a financial advisor who provided professional-looking prospectuses and other documents. Once the victim had selected a suitable investment, they went through an application process and provided ID documents. The Scam Centre collaborated with ASIC and private and public partners to disrupt the scam by removing the ad, taking down the scam website, providing an investor alert to the public, and diverting attempted calls by victims to a recorded warning message. So bank accounts used to launder stolen money, including an account identified by the Scam Centre, were blocked by the relevant banks. This intelligence, along with relevant Scamwatch data, was shared with police, who also shared information with overseas enforcement partners. And that just gives you an example that kind of brings together all those parts of the ecosystem and shows the relevance in the scam and how by working together, you can target it from a lot of different perspectives. And just finally, on the final slide, just some of the achievements in the last quarter of the year. So we just highlighted the decrease in scam reports, some of the piloting of the call disruption technology. We utilised a takedown service, and over 3,000 investment scam and phishing websites have been taken down. Telecommunications providers in Australia blocked over 246 million scam calls and 106 million SMS. And again, since the establishment of the centre, we are seeing a downward trend in losses. But I am hesitant because I know that they can go down for a few months and then they can go up a lot as well. So we'll be monitoring scams very carefully over the next few months. We'll also be starting a new fusion cell, and we're just looking at what topic that'll be at the moment. But really glad that we've been able to work with all of the partners, particularly the banks and law enforcement and the telcos in Australia. And we are starting to see that some of the initiatives can have an impact. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jayde. Very interesting and also very impressive reductions. Congratulations with that. We have a lot of questions in the chat. Let me show you a few, which are all around data sharing. Maybe start with the question of Donashe. What data portals are you going to use apart from Scamwatch?
Yeah, so at the moment, we have linked up with Report Cyber, as I mentioned. So that's the main police reporting one for cybercrime in Australia. We're also connecting with the Australian Financial Crimes Exchange. And so that's used for transaction data by the major banks. But there's also increasingly some other private sectors, like some of the telco on the Financial Crimes Exchange. We've set up links with the Australian Securities Investment Commission. So we're sharing investment scam report data. And we're also talking to some of the other government organisations that have large sources of data, like Services Australia and the Australian Taxation Office, as well as some of the other private sector businesses too. One of the other things we do is we share in real time information where somebody consents to a victim support service. So if a victim reports to the Scam Centre, then they'll be able to be referred in real time to ID Care and get some support for the type of loss that they might have had, whether that's identity compromise or some significant financial loss. So we're connecting up in quite a lot of ways, and certainly really interested where there are information sources relating to scams. We're always willing to have a conversation.
Excellent. Also a question related to data sharing from Pavel. Suspicious cases, what do you do with those? I mean, there are, of course, a little bit on the border.
Yeah, look, this is one of the interesting parts that comes up in our discussions with some of the partners around data sharing. So in some instances, it can be really important for recipients of data to understand I guess, the validity or the authenticity behind a scam report, whether it has been validated as actually being a scam or whether it's just an alleged scam. Scamwatch is in a unique position in that we have hundreds of thousands of reports where people are just telling us they observed or saw a scam. And so that can give really good insights into new scams that might not yet have caused loss, but they can be very difficult to authenticate. So in the course of some of the discussions we're having around data sharing, one of the conversations that we're having is that in a sense, you need to have sort of a rating or an indication of the sort of validity of that intelligence or how verifiable, whether it's verified or not. So that's something we're looking at. So that in some instances, if we're sharing it and asking for an action to occur, the people receiving that really need to understand, that we know that that's a scam, as compared to sometimes bringing data together where we're not sure it's a scam. When you pull all that together and look at that, it can help you actually verify a scam. So there's kind of a lot of different categories, I think, of data and intelligence that will be shared, and some of it for quite different purposes. So it's a bit of a case by case.
Thank you very much, Jayde. Maybe interesting to know that in Europe, some of the police forces share data with us when the website has been reported 3 times to them. The magic number 3 strikes and you're out. I don't know if it's good, but it might be an idea. Unfortunately, there are many more questions, but we have to go to the next speaker. Chris, may I give you the floor? You're on mute, I think. Let me unmute you. Yes, go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, George. Hi, everyone. I'm going to look at this issue that Jayde's just touched on from the perspective of National Australia Bank and talk through what we've experienced, what we're doing, what we've done, how we perceive the environment, and some of the challenges within the environment. So if we could just go on to the next slide, please. So I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here, but to try and do some level setting, I wanted to touch on why scams are really challenging to prevent and detect for banks, as opposed to traditional forms of fraud like credit card fraud. I mean, firstly, in a scam, typically a customer is using their own device. They pass all the authentication, password, identification protections that we have implemented into our systems. They're transacting on their own account, and really importantly, they're doing so voluntarily. The payments themselves often don't look abnormal, and a number that is, probably a little bit educative there, and no bank would be different to this. Last year, NAB processed around about 1 billion digital payments through our banking system, and in amongst that 1 billion digital payments were 18,600 scam events. So we're trying to find those 18,600 scam events in a scenario where the customer is voluntarily making the payment using their own device on their own account. So it's a non-trivial problem, particularly if you want to also ensure you're having as least impact as possible on customers who are making legitimate payments, and you're not disrupting business and the economy. Customers also often don't believe that they are in fact caught up in a scam. One of the evil skills, I guess you could call it, of these organised crime groups is that they employ people who are highly gifted at socially engineering their victims, at identifying their victims and then socially engineering them. And you probably most egregiously see this in some of the scam typologies like romance and friendship scams, where these crooks will engage a person, engage a victim, and keep them engaged over a very long period of time in the belief that they're in a genuine relationship, and they will steal money from them until the victim has no money left. I have seen so many cases, as I'm sure most of you have, where banks have intervened when they've seen a suspicious payment in these situations, and the customer is absolutely adamant that they know what they're doing, that they know where their money is going, that they've done all the research that they need to do to ensure that it's going to be safe. And yet they go ahead and make the payment, and obviously down the track they find out that they've been scammed. It does raise a question, and it's one that all the banks are grappling with at the moment, is at what point do we intervene and prevent a customer from transacting on using their own account and using their own funds? And I think, I'll talk a little bit about this later, but I think we're moving into an environment now where banks will need to be a lot more interventionist than we have historically been, and we may need to start acting almost as a customer's conscience in cases where we are convinced that they are caught in a scam. Now, that's a very different environment to one that we typically operate in, because we are removing people's rights to access their own money in ways that they want to access them. I think the other thing that's challenging is that scams occur, I guess, on a continuum from the moment that the criminals, the organised criminals, contact their victim through to when a payment is made. And the bank sits at the end of that continuum. We sit right at the end when the customer starts making a payment. All this other stuff happens in the meantime, and that's the criminals sending a text message or a phone call or advertising on an online platform, a victim interacting with that text message, the phone call or the advertisement, a process of some sort of conversation, whether it's over a phone or messaging service between the victim and the criminal, and that finally leads to a payment being made. Because banks can't see all that activity that's happened in the lead up to the payment, we have to make judgments based on the relatively slim amount of information that we have. Another factor that makes it difficult. And I want to just expand on a point that I thought Jayde made really well, and that is that scams occur within an ecosystem. Banks are definitely part of that ecosystem, and I would say a critical part of that ecosystem. But telecommunications providers, online providers, messaging services, government regulators, and consumers are all part of that same ecosystem. And whilst we've made a lot of progress, and the NASC has been critical, the National Anti-Scam Centre has been critical in some of this over the last 12 to 18 months, we've made a lot of progress in getting those different parts of the ecosystem more aligned and more coordinated and thinking in the same ways. I think it'd be safe to say we still have a long way to go. Thanks, George. Can I get the next slide? So I wanted to, so it was really great that Jayde set the scene for what's happening at a national level. This is what's happening from a national Australia, through a national Australia Bank lens over the last 6 months or so. So I guess what you could say is that the couple of key messages there, the number of attacks against our customers and against the bank have continued to increase. So the environment itself is still incredibly hostile. The organised criminal groups who are driving the majority of this scam activity are still out there. They are still targeting Australians. They're still targeting NAB's customers. But consistent with the data that Jayde just spoke to, losses from scams have decreased compared to this time last year. And I'm probably less optimistic, I think, than other people. I'm not brave enough to call this a trend at this stage, but it's encouraging that we're starting to see a reduction. And there's a range of reasons that I'll talk to what I think we've done as a bank to help drive some of that and what we've contributed to. But there's some key things that have remained the same as well. So 95% of scams that impact NAB's customers occur via our digital banking channels. So either internet banking, the mobile banking app on people's phones, or our business banking digital channel. Only a very small proportion occur in a more face-to-face environment, for example, over the counter in a bank branch or via telegraphic transfers or that sort of payment mechanism. The vast majority of loss and volume of events occur via digital payment channels. We continue to see that investment scams, whilst they make up a relatively small proportion of overall cases, are the greatest cause of loss to our customers from scams. That's probably not surprising given the nature of those types of scams and the types of customers that the criminals are targeting through the different schemas that they use. What we have seen over the past few months is an increase in business email compromise or invoice scams, which is interesting because if I think back when the scams epidemic really started to hit Australia in 2021, thereabouts, business email compromise was a key feature of that epidemic, and it slowly reduced down, and investment scams became the primary means of attack, and phishing, I have to say, and phishing involving impersonation of banks in particular was a really common schema. We're now starting to see business email compromises occurring again. There's a few reasons for that, I think. I think number one, consistent with what Jayde said, at a national level, we've made a concerted effort to target investment scams. And anyone that works in this fraud space will know that when you push on the balloon in one place, it'll drop down, but it'll pop up somewhere else because the criminals are not going to stop targeting us simply because we've got better at preventing one type of criminal activity. They will pivot to something else. And I think we have to be realistic and accept that we're dealing with highly sophisticated, very well resourced, very resilient and pretty ruthless criminal groups here who have, amongst many other things, scams as part of their business model, and they're not going to walk away from it just because we're starting to make life a bit more difficult for them around one type of scam. Next slide, please, Jim. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about what NAB has done, and I'm going to try and make this not sound like an advertisement for my organisation because I'll be the first to admit that we've got areas where we could really lift our game. I guess we've approached the challenge strategically. One of the first things that we did in 2021 was come together as an entire enterprise, so not just the fraud team that I lead, but every part of the bank came together and we developed and implemented an enterprise-wide scam strategy. So we committed ourselves to implementing a range of initiatives, about 35 initiatives to date, specifically to make ourselves more resilient, to protect our customers more from scams. And I'll talk a little bit about what those were. But in general terms, what we saw was we needed to move more payments into a real-time payment environment. And the reason for that was so that we could see those payments occurring in real time in our fraud system and intervene to decline or block those payments if we had fraud concerns about them. We decided to implement more friction into our payments so that if we saw a payment that looked suspicious, we would intervene in real time and send a warning message to our customers to say, hey, this looks like it could be a scam or a fraud. Are you sure you want to proceed with the payment? And we set that so that the customer has to interact with that message before they can proceed with the payment. That's been highly, highly successful for us. That started in March last year, so we've been going over 12 months. And what we've seen is that on average, around $250,000 a day in payments are being fully abandoned by our customers. So it's been a highly successful measure. We've also targeted the recovery process and the customer response process. So we've got our house in order in terms of how quickly we answer the phone when a customer wants to report a scam to us. We were partners with the other banks in Australia in establishing an online portal which allows us to report scams to each other, so that if another bank reports a scam to me, I can look at, and I'm the recipient bank, I can move much more quickly now to block the recipient account, recover funds for the other bank, and it operates in both directions. And we invested a lot of time and effort in public advocacy, speaking as frankly as we possibly can to the media and to the community about what we were doing, what the challenges were, and what we saw happening in that scam space, to raise awareness of what was going on and to set people's expectations about what NAB would and would not be able to do for them if they ever fell victim to a scam. We've ensured that our scam strategy has the highest possible visibility. So our strategy is endorsed by the NAB board. It's monitored regularly, progress against it. There are metrics that we use to track the progress of the strategy. And as I speak right now, we're going through a review of the strategy. It's been 2 years since the first iteration was implemented. The environment's changed a lot since then. For example, the National Anti-Scam Centre didn't exist when we implemented our strategy. We know that the Australian government will be introducing legislation and mandatory codes for different parts of the ecosystem, including banks at some point this year or early next year. So we're moving into a different political environment, a different economic environment, a different operational threat environment. So it's time for us to update our strategy, which we're doing right now. Some of the other things that we've done, we've looked to block payments to high-risk merchants, or high-risk getaway vehicles, as I call them. So it's been a little bit controversial, but one of the industries that we've seen and had a problem with are cryptocurrency exchanges. So for NAB, if we see a cryptocurrency exchange where the volume of fraud of payments that turn out to be fraud or scam going to that exchange reach a certain threshold, we'll just block payments to that exchange until we see a change in behaviour. That was implemented in July last year and has made a very material contribution to reducing scams losses, and I think has been. We're not the only bank that's doing that, so this is not a NAB-only story. Just about every other bank in Australia is doing that in one way, shape or form, and I'm sure that's played a critical role in helping to get a reduction in overall scams losses, particularly when you see that there is often a nexus between investment scams and cryptocurrency as the means for moving the funds out of the victim's account. To Jayde's point, we've worked with the telecommunications companies to put enhanced protection around NAB's phone numbers and our SMSs. That was critical because we were specifically targeted late last year by an organised crime group who were impersonating NAB and were quite successful in stealing a lot of money from our customers. So putting those protections in place, we've seen about a 76% reduction in those types of scam events. So that was actually quite effective. And we've also taken URLs or links out of our text messages to just remove that as a vector for criminals to target our customers. Might jump to the next slide, please, George. So I thought I'd touch on what I think the future holds. So the first thing, and it'd be at the forefront of my mind and my peers' minds around the country, is we know that the government is going to legislate. We know that there's going to be a mandatory code for designated entities, and banks will be designated entities under the legislation. We have expectations around high expectations around what that code will be in terms of I think we have a reasonable idea. The government's been very open in discussing the code with us. They've sought our input, and I think we can expect to see banks being subject to quite high standards and obligations. But if we meet those obligations, the government and the minister have been pretty clear that we won't be held liable. Every bank is going to want to achieve those obligations for really obvious reasons. I'm encouraged by that, because one of the challenges of this environment at the moment is it's unclear around what our obligations as a bank are, and anything that can be brought in to clarify and make that much more certain for banks and for consumers and customers is a great outcome. We're all going to continue investing in incremental control enhancements. So I talked a bit about the alerts and the warning messages that we put into the payment process. We'll expand those to cover additional typologies as we see those emerge. But I think it's important to recognise as well that those enhancements that we can do internally will only be incremental improvements. We're not going to see transformative or large step changes as a result of those. I think the transformational changes, where they lie now, where those opportunities lie for the future, are around sharing data across the industry and sharing data across industry sectors. So I think next year, or this year or early next year, you'll start to see banks signing up to real-time data exchange, so that both the sending bank and the receiving bank can make a risk-based decision about whether they should let the payment go or accept the payment. That will be completely game-changing if and when that comes. Some of us are also talking to other parts of the ecosystem, telecommunications providers, to see if we can use real-time data from telecommunications providers with our real-time banking data to make a risk-based decision around whether a payment or a banking session should be allowed to continue. And I think we're going to have to see more coordination and collaboration across the entire ecosystem. My personal view is that every part of the ecosystem has to be collaborative and chime in and help with that, but the leader for it should be the National Anti-Scam Centre. They are the natural point of leadership and coordination. And what we've seen to date from the National Anti-Scam Centre has been super encouraging, and I think we're heading in the right direction. Long way to go. I don't think anyone would say we're anywhere near being where we need to be, but we are in a much better place now than we were 18 months ago. Thanks very much. I think you're on mute, mate. You're on mute, George.
Beginner mistake. Thank you very much, Chris. I want to make sure that we keep in time. So, Sean, may I give you the floor?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, George, and thanks everybody. I can assure you there's been no collaboration at the moment between the decks that have been presented by two very, very passionate people, between Jayde and Chris, and pretty much what I'm going to be sharing over the next few minutes is echoing everything that's been said here. Look, I work with Feedzai, and it's a global company that specializes in fraud and financial crime prevention. While Jayde shared something about the national capability, and Chris spoke specifically on National Australia Bank. I'm going to give a bit of a global awareness of what we're seeing. Because look, we're working with all of the major banks across the world, where in some cases annually we're looking at over $3 trillion of payments going through Feedzai's platforms. So if we move on to the next slide, please, George. So traditionally, fraud and scams, look, it was seen as a cost of doing business, and that was something that was impacted the bottom line. And from my personal experience from working on the other side of the fence, the only time I ever saw a government body get involved with a bank was it was to do with financial crime prevention. It was to do anti-money laundering, KYC, and sanction screening. It was pretty much unheard for a government or a regulator to start knocking on the door for fraud. Now, I've watched Jayde shared a very, very big number, that 3.2 billion was lost in 2022. Actually, 3.2 billion was reported as lost in scams. I think the multiple of that was actually quite higher. So if I look at that number, and we can hazard a guess, but it's 4 times or 5 times anyway, it's a huge, huge number. This is an issue that is significantly impacting Australians, not just even directly, but indirectly, because this money is financing a lot of very, very dark criminal activity. Thankfully, the government has stepped in and And through the National Anti-Scam Centre, which I echo what Chris is saying, is a fantastic body. It's bringing everybody together in that ecosystem. And what we're experiencing globally is that there's absolutely going to be stronger legislation. This is a must. I think if you look across the UK and across Europe, it's becoming actually quite stronger. And from October the 7th in the UK, the landscape is going to change considerably. But while it's absolutely key, and again, it's been echoed, there needs to be a focus across the entire ecosystem. Now, yes, the banks need to play their part, for sure. But social media platforms absolutely need to lift their game. I use social media platforms. Every day I'm being targeted. Honestly, every single day I'm being targeted. I can see investment scams, see romance scams. It's there, it's out there, and they're not coming down quick enough. So there's a huge volume of information out there in the social media platform. And frankly, they need to do a lot more. That's absolutely key. Telcos have upped their game. There's been great collaboration between some of the telcos and the banks. And again, Jayde mentioned some of the great results in what's happened. But again, the volume of information that's there within these organizations, they need to do more, absolutely need to do more. And, real-time data intelligence sharing across this entire ecosystem is the only way forward. It's where we need to be. Next slide, please. So focusing in on banks and financial institutions as a sole entity, again, historically, investment in this space has been very, very reactive. Frankly, fraud has been significantly under-invested in over the last 10 years. And I'm speaking from personal experience from working in some of the largest banks in the world. We know how important it is to break down silos between departments. I love what Chris has shared about what's happening at a board level within National Australia Bank. But the success in responding to scams is directly linked to how successful we are at managing risk across the full customer journey. And that's leveraging all of the data, all of the time, in real time. So this means all non-human intelligence, device intelligence, behavioral biometrics, all internal financial and non-financial data at a customer-centric level. And again, being able to have the capability of bringing all of this enriched data that you're allowed to use, because privacy is a very, very important factor, but you're allowed to use from the external part of the ecosystem. And again, under the guidance of the National Anti-Scam Centre, this is where it needs to happen. So, it's only a case when you look at protecting your customers, is when you understand the intent associated with the transaction. And again, that's all of the information in real time, right across your organization internally, and leveraging everything that's available externally. Next slide, please. So just one example of an initiative that we're helping with some of our customers, primarily in the UK and Europe. And we believe it's a key game changer. Again, we're talking about scams, but one part of the scam ecosystem internally is mules. And that's something I've not actually heard anybody speak about today. Mule account is the off-ramps. Yes, we've heard about one of the industries that's traditionally been seen as a significant off-ramp, but it's a case that we need to understand what's happening around the inbound payments just as much as the outbound payments. So we're working with some of our customers on truly trying to understand the intent. That means banks are beginning to screen all inbound payments and ask the question, do they actually want to receive this money? I can see a case where a bank will refuse to receive money from another bank if they do not believe the controls are right and correct. So this is enabling banks to look at the mule problem in a completely different way by scoring the inbound transaction. It's also about enriching all of the information. And what we are doing is building out a propensity model for mules where our customers can look at what's happening. And this is going to have a significant impact on the overall scam capability. Absolutely key. Next slide, please. So look, this is a slide. It's pretty much self-explanatory from what everybody has shared over the last half hour or so. Data sharing is critical. Real-time data sharing is the only true way forward. And again, I'm going to turn around and say it's real-time data sharing from social media, from telcos and from financial institutions. And the only true way that can happen is where it can be done in a safe environment, a safe harbour, and that's through legislation. So data privacy coming from government sector really is to help the industry. It's critical. You know, there are still organisations who are struggling with legacy traditional tech, and I have a lot of empathy for this. I know organisations have thousands of rules that have built up over the years, even a hacked internal build, and that's been out of pure necessity. So I've a huge amount of empathy for my previous colleagues and people in industry, because they've been doing their absolute best. You don't get involved in fraud and financial crime prevention unless you're extremely passionate about it. And everybody's trying to do their best, but you know, the C-suite and all these organizations really need to invest. The profits are there. I'm going to call it out right across all the ecosystem, not just banks, making billions and billions of dollars. It's time to really up the game and invest to start preventing this. There's really no excuse. You know, if we're able to look at all of the information all of the time in real time to protect not just the consumer but Australian citizens, it's going to make a significant impact on you know, on this country and the lifestyle. So last slide, I think, please. So just to conclude, echoing what everybody said, collaboration is key. You know, combating scams is a shared responsibility. It's not just on the banks, it's right across the full ecosystem. And we have to stay vigilant, and we have to really be committed to working with each other. And, you know, it's through the National Anti-Scam Centre that mechanism should happen. That should be the safe harbour. And government needs to really quickly bring in the right legislation to allow us to do what the right thing is to do. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sean, for your presentation. There are a lot of questions in the chat. So if Chris, Jayde, and Sean, if you wouldn't mind having a look and answering some of the questions, that would be great. I want to use the last 5 minutes to look into the future. I mean, when we are in 2030, where do you think we are, and which measure do we still have to take to really fight scams? Chris, may I start with you?
So you're saying, say, 2030, yeah, Georgie? Where do we need to be then?
The future. I mean, yeah. Can we win the battle, and what do we need to do now to ensure that we win it?
Look, we're not... I don't want to sound pessimistic, because I'm not pessimistic. I don't think you can last very long in this work if you have a pessimistic approach to it. But we also have to be pragmatic and understand that we are not going to ever stop being targeted by organised criminal groups, because their whole business model is based on crime and stealing money or acquiring illicit funds through criminality. So that threat's not going to go away. Where I think we can have a coordinated ecosystem that is sharing data in real time, that understand its environment and its threats much more quickly when they emerge, and reacts much more effectively and much more quickly when they emerge, that has a clear legislative and regulatory framework that we operate within and understand and are by and large compliant with, except by exception when we make mistakes, which are inevitable. We will make mistakes from time to time. And we have a community who is much more aware of the threat and how they can protect themselves. And a quick analogy, when motor vehicles were first mass produced and people started driving them in large numbers, we had a very high number of fatalities and injuries on the road. Why? Because we didn't have the safety features that we have now in cars. We didn't have the road rules and the policing of road rules, etc., that we have now. We have to remember that we're only 10, 15, maybe 20 years, if you're generous, into a digital economy, a digital environment, and digital banking. We're still learning as a nation, as a world, how to do that safely. And we will get better and better and better at that. So when I look at 2030, this will be a problem that is still a problem, but it will be a problem that we can probably look ourselves in the mirror and say we're largely in control of it. We understand it. We'll never stop it all, but it's not running away like it is at the moment.
Thank you very much, Chris. Jayde, if you would be the Prime Minister of Australia, unlimited resources, what would you do? And I have problems unmuting you. Can you unmute yourself? Yes.
Yes, unmuted. Prime Minister, what would I do? Look, I think I don't want to cover off on the same things Chris has said. One of the things I would do, I think, is really make sure that when implementing new technology or new systems or new industries, that all businesses start to think a bit more proactively about the potential for those things to be exploited by scammers. So taking it one step further from the reactive work, but actually how we can build things that are scam proof in a sense. So probably, especially as we start to see the explosion of different technologies, and I'm thinking about AI and other things, that we have to really think about how these things could be used by scammers. And then make sure we're building in the right protections and the right policies and legislative, if that's required, or regulations to support it. We want to evolve and have, some of these technologies are fantastic for consumers, for the public, for businesses. I think, though, we want to make sure that we really think about in the design of these things how we can protect the community from them being used against them. And we see this over and over again in the way that some technology is being used now, particularly I think about some of the telecommunications technology that is exploited by scammers, the spoofing of phone numbers and things like that. I think we just really, if I was Prime Minister, I think I would really take it back and make sure that all major kind of technologies and businesses think about these issues in the design of the systems that they are building, and that then we're not having to address the issues later on. So that'd be my ideal future world.
All right. Thank you, Jayde. And you will definitely have my vote, although I'm not an Australian. But Sean, last but not least, and looking at the big picture, and what would be the measure you would like to take forward?
Oh, look, for me, it's really simple. And my nirvana is that there's a percentage of profits from all these organizations that go back into the industry to protect the Australian citizens in this space. That simple.
That's a good statement. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I really would like to thank also the audience, and especially those from Europe. I even see people from Brazil and the United States, which I think is very, very late in the night. Thank you very much for attending and for all your questions. I also really like to thank Jayde and Chris and Sean for all their good work. And I'm sure we will speak again, because as Chris was saying, it's not a battle which will be over for a very, very, very long time. But thank you for all your efforts. And I wish you all a very good afternoon or evening, or to some of the audience, a very good morning or a very good afternoon. Thank you very much, all of you, and love to speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.